Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, Video 4 for the Yogavataranam, and we'll be looking at the section on 4th, 6th and 10th class verbs. This should be quite simple actually because they all follow the same pattern, the same endings as the first class that we've just done, but with some slight but easily comprehensible variations. So we will look first at the sorry, still clunking about. I'll get used to it. So we'll look first at page 30, and I'll read through the text at the passage beginning 4th, 6th, and 10th class verbs. So, as mentioned earlier, these three classes plus the first class verbs detailed above form the group of thematic verbs. And remember that that's the verbs that add an a after the root. Now, the fourth class verbs are conjugated exactly like first class verbs, except that the gana sign, the class sign ya, that's the sign ya, is added to the verbal base before second and third person endings, and is lengthened to ya, as with the other verbs, before first person endings. The fourth class is called divadi, meaning beginning with div, meaning to play, which is the first verb in the traditional Paninian organization of this group. So let's look at this verb meaning to dance. I'll write it for you in the Roman script. And here we go. I'll share a screen with you. There we are. So nrit is to dance. In fact, the verbal noun is a nritya. Sometimes in Hindi seen as natya. Have you heard of nacha? You've heard of the Bharatnach, the Indian dancing. It's from this same root. So this is being a fourth class verb. It adds the ya to the root. So instead of nritame, for example, nritati, which doesn't exist, it adds a tia. So looking at the third person singular, that line you have, reading first person singular, it looks like this: nrit plus ya plus ti. So that makes he, she, or it dances. Nrityati. And I dance. Nrit plus ya plus me. Nrityami. You'll see that in all of these thematic verbs, that's the verbs that add an a to the root to make their present system. It's all the a always lengthens to a in the first person. Ami, ava, ama. That's nrityati, but nrityami. At the bottom of page 30, this verb is now declined in the first person, parasmaipada, sorry, in the present tense, parasmaipada, active. Hopefully you should be able to work out the Devanagari for yourself by now. So what I'll do, I'll just read it through to you slowly, going across the lines and then down, and then I'll write it out for you in Roman script on the screen. So, nrityati, nrityata, nrityanti, nrityasi, Nrityata, nrityata, nrityami, nrityava, nrityama. I'll write these out for you. Nrityati, nrityata, nrityanti, nrityasi, nrityata. You two, both of you dance. Nrityata and nrityata. You dance, plural. And then first person, nrityami, I dance. Nrityavaha, we two dance. And nrityama. Excuse me. So you'll see that these actually are exactly the same endings as the verbs we've just done, the first class verbs, pat and so on. The only difference being that this y is added after the root. One thing I'll mention here for the benefit of Pali students, a puzzling feature that is explained by this, is that where you get this consonant in the root followed by a ya in the Sanskrit, this results in the doubling of that consonant, almost always results in the doubling of that consonant in Pali. So we get something like this. So from nrityati, for example, nrityati in Sanskrit becomes nachati in Pali, the tya followed by a vowel becoming a double ch, nachati. And as the Pali students will know, of course, the vowel rit doesn't exist in Pali. That changes to either a, I, or u, depending. Another one, for example, is nash. Nashyati, to be lost or destroyed. And in Pali, that becomes nasati. So this explains why in many Pali verbs, in present tense, you see this otherwise unexplained doubling, and also a letter that doesn't quite seem to belong. So that's from a nrit and nata and so on. This explains tya becomes a ch, nrityati, nachati. We've learned budh and bodhati, but there's also an alternative form, budhyati, or budhyati actually in Sanskrit. We haven't quite got to it yet, but I'll show you to illustrate this point. In Sanskrit, budhyate, in Pali, to wake up, becomes bujhati. Again, that explains what from the root budh, bodhi, buddha, that explains how we suddenly have a double J here. It's because of the budhyate becomes bujhati in Pali. Right, now we will go to the list of verbs at the top of page 31. The top is tush, meaning to be pleased or contented, satisfied, tush, and that becomes tushyati. And again, as you'd expect in Pali, that becomes tussati. Div, to play, divyati. Nash, we've just dealt with above. Nash, nashyati, to be lost or destroyed. And push, the retroflex sh, push, and becomes pushyati. So all following this this conjugation, this class of verbs where we just had a yet after the root. Now we go on to the next section, which is the sixth class of verbs. Oh, before we go on, for those of you who don't like to leave behind something unexplained, I'll just explain what's in that yellow box about tush. It says tush is the root of the verb, sorry, the word santosha. Let me write it out for you, santosha. That's the one meaning contentment. So it's the second niyama, observance, and the second limb of the Ashtanga Yoga. So contentment is the second anga, the second limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, becomes Ashtanga Yoga, literally the eight-limbed yoga, the eight-part yoga. And from Santosh, in fact, we get at the beginning of line 2, verse 2 of the Metta Sutta, we get the monk should be Santussako. So Santosa Santushya in Sanskrit. We'll come to how this word is formed. It's from that same base. Santushya means satisfiable, easily satisfied. If you're Santushyaka, in Pali, Santussako, easily satisfied, pleased with little, is one of the virtuous qualities. Santussakocha, subharocha, apakichosa, sallahukabuti. So that's the Santussako from the same root, tush, to satisfy. Now back to our class sixth. And here we have the root vish, where vish equals to enter, vish. The declension of this verb exactly follows the first class. The only difference is based on whether or not the base changes. I'll explain what I mean. When we were looking at the first class verbs, you'll see at the very top, in fact, the very first line, if you go back to page 29, we'll see we're looking at class 1 now. Bud, bodhati. This is a phenomenon, the u changing to o, known as guna, just giving it a heavier quality, u, o. We'll deal with that in detail as we go along. And sometimes the e changes to an a as well. And that actually happened because of a difference in stress in the Old Vedic and the Sanskrit, because in the first class of verb, the stress is on the root syllable. So bhu, bhavati. We normally don't bother with stress. Now, it was important in Vedic times. It's much less important in classical Sanskrit and in Pali, but it does explain things that otherwise would not be explicable. So where you get a syllable that is stressed, it often tends, not always, it often tends to strengthen the vowel, the strengthening from u to o. So bodhati, because it is stressed. And the e to a, just u to o, also by the same phenomenon, e to a, for example, You have something like sid, sedhati, with the stress on that first syllable. That's a characteristic of the first class of verbs, that the stress falls on that root syllable. In the sixth class, the utu-o and the itu-e phenomenon does not occur. That's because in these verbs, the stress is actually on the second syllable. So vish. If the stress were on the first, if it were a first class verb, it would very likely become, which it's not, but it would likely become veshati. But it's not. The stress is on the second syllable, so it's vishati. Mark the acute over the A to mark the stress. Vishati. And likewise, we've seen bud becomes bodhati. Stress on the first syllable. Tud. We'll see that meaning to push. It's a verb on our page 31, near the bottom of the page. Tud becomes, because the stress moves to the ending, it's tudati. If this were a first-class verb, the tud would likely become todati, as in bodhati, but it's not. It stresses on the end. A sixth-class verb, therefore, tudati. But that is the only distinction between the first class and the sixth class, that the root does not strengthen because the stress is shifted to the end. But as I say, we don't pay too much attention to stress in Sanskrit. We can safely use the way that the modern Indians do it, which we'll learn as we go along. It's a fairly natural, rhythmical way of doing it. And so, again, dish. These now verbs down at the bottom. So dish, to show. Dishati. Dishati. And sprish, to touch. Sprishati. Again, if sprish were a first-class verb, it would most likely make its present tense in sparshati, that's strengthening the vowel from ri to ar, sparshati, but it's not. Stress on the end, sixth class, is sprishati, leaving the root unchanged. So I've just written here the verbs down, and kship, let's just do the last one in this list. Kship becomes kshipati. Kshipati, to throw. Now I've skipped over a conjugation of the full declension of the vish, but we'll do that now. I will read them through, and now looking just in the top of the second half of page 31. I'll go through that verb for you and read out all the present tense forms slowly. You see, there's vish plus the a, ti, vishati, vish plus a plus mi, vishami. That means to enter. So reading across the lines as before from the third person. Vishati, vishata, vishanti. Vishasi, vishata, vishata. Vishami, vishavah, vishamah. So, also, sorry, I skipped out the paragraph immediately under sixth class. For sixth class verb, it says the gana sign is a before the second and third person endings, and a before the first person endings. Although this is the same rule for the first class verbs, the difference is that in this case, the verbal root and the verbal base are almost always identical. The sixth class is called tudadi, meaning beginning with tud, to push, the first verb of the group. And the author didn't mention here the reason for that, which is the difference in where the stress accent, the tonic accent, falls in Vedic. Now we will go on to the 10th class of verbs, and they, again, virtually identical in formation, save that with the, instead of adding a ya, which is the 6th class, sorry, for 4th class, it adds aya for the 10th class. And the aya is very, very frequently a causative form. And just a brief aside now for Pali. So we have gum, to go, the ordinary present tense gacchati, but you make a causative gamayati. Note that in the meaning to go, gam becomes gacchati, but when it's a causative, you just add ayati and you don't alter the root there, gamayati. That gamayati, the aya, almost always becomes just an e in Pali. So gamayati, Sanskrit, gameti, Pali. So let's go down to what it says on the page 32 now. 10th class verbs add the gana sign aya before the second and third person endings, and lengthened, as always, to aya before the first person endings. That's the ami, ava, and ayami, ayava, ayama for the first person. The 10th class is called churadi, meaning beginning with chur, to steal, the first verb of the group. So we will look now at this root that's given here, the one meaning to think or contemplate, and that is chint. Now this actually derives from a much more primitive root, chit, which we have in, chitta, one's mind. So chint is a secondary formation then from that root. So chint, I'll read now through the conjugation of it. Chintayati, chintayata, chintayanti, chintayasi, chintayata, chintayata, chintayami, chintayava, chintayamah. I'll now just write those out for you from the Devanagari in the middle of page 32. So chintayati, chintayata, chintayanti, chintayasi, chintayata, chintayata, chintayami, chintayava, and chintayama. And some examples are given below that. Is kat, the root kat, to tell, katayati. And as usual, as we would expect in Pali, we have kateti, tells. Gan, to count, Ganayati. Oops. Chur, root to steal. A chora, by the way, is a thief. Chur, chorayati. And puj, long u, pujayati. So we now see the first class with the stress on the root and sometimes the lengthening of the syllable, bodhati. In the fourth class, we have the root, just adding a ya to it, but otherwise all of the endings are exactly as in the first class, nrityati. In the sixth class, the same as the first class, with the stress on the end, tud, not tudati, but tudati, bodhati, but tudati. And finally, the 10th class, where you had the aya ending, so katayati. Right, that is all on this clip.